I'm just listening to Owen Jones with some guest on who's an MP from Labour Party, and they're talking about how Labour needs to make Angie Rayner the Prime Minister, but as an ace in the hole, have Andy Burnham in the background. But the problem that they've got is that he can't win a seat. So if he can't win a seat, how's he qualified to be Prime Minister? I mean, there's been plenty of videos exposing how Manchester's crumbling, and I don't know how it's not crumbling because I'm just up the road, and there's no overspill of thriving and prosperity. There's no the psychological trauma that people are going through with what's going on is not being countered by Andy Burnham, who's the mayor of Manchester, next door to the regional city mayor of Steve Rotherham. So the whole idea is that left and right is supposed to find the middle ground, which they often do, but they don't find the middle ground that is appeasing, the majority. They find the middle ground that appeases the Epstein class, nothing more, nothing less. So the dilemma is that the whole country is sitting on the balance of a party who can't rustle up a leader, and the leaders that they have got behind the scenes, Ed Miliband, Tony Blair, Peter Mandelson, they're the string pullers, immediately. Obviously, they've got their handlers, but I'm talking about in the immediate situation, in the real politic. That's who's making the bigger decisions. Now, none of those big decisions are agriculture, shipping, fishing, construction. There's another big construction firm has just gone bust today. The universities now are talking about going bust. The Russell Group, I think it is. There's 163,000 jobs getting waylaid from a report by AOL. And we're only in May. Do you know what I mean? This is the springtime heading into summer where we should be blooming and blossoming, and yet it's like a winter. It's like a summer of discontent. So obviously my gambit goes back to Thatcher's changing of the banking rules, which was never her decision. It was Keith Joseph's and Alfred Sherman's decision. And because she's always drunk, she doesn't understand economics and politics. She's just at window dressing for the people looking at, oh, there's a Margaret Thatcher, I'll give her an X. When the actual nitty gritty, let's get down to the bare metal of the nuts and bolts of the situation. The whole setup was being ran way beyond her knowledge and awareness. She was just doing the administration for everything, making catcalls in Parliament, which is basically what Parliament is. It's just a cat house, isn't it? That, in every disrespectful way that you can imagine, because they get nothing done. They work tirelessly to do nothing, to do absolutely bare minimum and less than minimum when they can, because they get not so much paid, but it's the the increase in benefits of the status. I was watching one session and there was an MP sitting there picking her nose. So how's that supposed to inspire the country? How are these people managing their rhetoric so that it's built for, you know, because when you write a speech or a document, it's a construction of thoughts and ideas for tangibility, and yet the floor has almost fallen through in the whole scape of industry, commerce, economics, the black market. The police aren't even equipped to understand white collar crime, and the City of London is it's one of the central hubs, or was one of the central hubs of finance. It's still barely hanging on, like I don't know how, and I don't think that'll last for long. So there are these tangents and tangible events that have to be taken into consideration about what's tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And it doesn't seem, well, there is no vision, is there? The only vision is sort of like cling onto your seat because all hell is about to break loose, and it's the breaking loose of all hell that the people pay for, while the politicians just absolutely squander and use all that public money basically to insulate themselves as part of a damage, was it, like damage control, damage management, the collateral damage. They're just trying to not get in the way, and they're just trying to throw everyone under the bus, because it's like there's a seamlessly endless amount of, especially, the colour of people that they love to throw under the bus. There's an endless rhetoric that can be thrown under the bus to virtue signal more wages. It's like they just put the finger up the proverbial bum and money drops out. So the more that they ridicule, embarrass, humiliate the general public of Britain, then the more they can cash in. It's like we're living in like a Las Vegas type casino, where, is it rigged or isn't it rigged? Well, pays your money, takes your chances. If it's rigged, then what are you going to do about it? Because the police are well ill-equipped to do anything about white-collar crime. The infrastructure is set up as an army to do white-collar crime. And the third thing is like the people have no insurance against this, and especially no reinsurance. The people are their only, they're self-guarantors, they're the surety for their own ends at the end of the day. And this was seen in 1830s in the First Opium Wars, when trusts, there was a book by Thomas Lewin called The Law of Trusts and Trustees, and in there it talks about how, with Lionel de Rothschild becoming the MP for the City of London and Westminster, the empire suddenly flourished all over the world under Queen Victoria. And trustees were not holding up their end of the bargain. Well, where do you go for recompensation, or how to govern the law of the trust? Well, it's the courts. So if you read Bleak House by Charles Dickens, he's blowing the whistle on all of it. The whole system, when you look at the Judicature Acts of 1860s and 1870s, I think that's correct, where they amalgamate the jurisdictions of courts into what courts we have today, basically, like the 1870s Judicature Acts brought that about. But I was also looking lately at the Property Act of 1925, and apparently they've taken all the manorial laws, which were the hereditary laws, the legacy laws of, the passing of land, the usufruct, all of these kinds of like feoffment and feoffee, like the feudal and semi-feudal era laws which were governing the passing of titles of land. They've turned it into a quasi-feudal situation. And it's been the lawyers and the lawmakers, obviously, who've drafted all the laws. So you can imagine 1925, there's a lot going on. Now you've changed all of the laws from over 1,000 years. Well, say from 1066 even. 1066 to 1925. Yeah, it's just under 1,000 years. And Lord knows how laws before 1066 governed land, because all English law, property law, is in French. It's in the old French Norman language, the French Norman legal language. So you bring that right up today, and if, night follows day, then these lawmakers and the lawyers, of which the City of London is basically for, the Inns of Court, or I think the Inns of Court was the old version, and they're now called the Inns of Law, or something like that. They were called Inns of Law, and now they're called Inns of Court, something like that. But it's basically Lincoln's Inn, Gray's Inn, the Middle Bar, the Middle Temple, and the Inner Temple. They're the four lawyers, lawyer groups attached to the City of London. And they're big shouts, like they're not small shouts. They basically dictate to Parliament how Parliament shall be ran. So if you're running in Parliament, chances are that you're a complete wrong and right off the bat, because they wouldn't let you in if you were going to have any wrong think coming into the Parliament, like Shabana Sultana, the girl who's always getting kicked out. Like, her record's probably clean because she doesn't really have a record. She's literally first at most second generation immigrant, so she hasn't got like a past history of that can be manipulated by the Parliament. Plus they need the quota, so she ticks a box, and now she's an easy target for the parliamentarians to kind of like use and abuse and make an example of, and say, like, if we have any of this tawdry behaviour in there, it won't be tolerated. So basically it's like a wrong think democracy, or wrong think anti-democracy, anti-wrong think democracy, in that if you have rhetoric which is outside of the PR for Parliament, they're not going to let you anywhere near the place. So it's off to a bad start right off the bat, which is how you end up with the likes of Starmer. And the fella who was on the Owen Jones show then, he's a MP for Labour, And he's saying that Starmer's a manager. Well, he might be a manager, but he's a manager of a nursery group. He's like the speech he done yesterday. He done that kind of wishy-washy speech where he's trying to save his career. And I listened to some critics, and they were saying, he looked like he's the man who's turned up to fix the printer, not to run the country. He's not inspiring anything in anyone. He's not coming up with any solutions. He's not bringing any vision, any shared vision. He's not creating a cohesion between the peoples. Now, we've got, we're not a people, we're peoples. So the cohesion, it's not being worked on. And, there's plenty of that to see. So my kind of thought is that, with what's happened with the local government elections and the over 1,400 seats lost by who are now the ruling party, Labour, is that not proof positive of a great replacement theory in the people's minds at the very most? And what's being done to combat the effects of that psychological trauma, where it's an existential threat from within by your own elected politicians and leaders and representatives who seemingly are just there to attack in a war, in a economic war situation, a generational war situation, an existential war situation. These are some serious stakes. And you've got Starmer there telling, well, you could see the tone that he was speaking with. It was like, I'm the cool kid, I'm the boss. All you minions here, you get the benefit of listening to the waffle and I wouldn't say spurious, the spew of nothingness. It's just mindless and mind-numbing incoherence. There's no thread of coherent thought that you'd say, that A leads to B leads to C. He's not saying, look, what we need to do here is we'll give all the farmers a massive leap up, no tax for 10 years. They don't have to pay any tax for 10 years. They have to use natural fertilizers, pure natural fertilizers, no more chemicals, do away with all the chemicals. And we're going to have an abundance of foods that can be used and stored. So lots of grain, grain's an easy store, foods that are suited to our climate, foods that are suited to our geographic, what's it called, the topography. So that's a no-brainer. Then we've got the fishing. We're literally an island in the middle of the ocean. We could do a deal with Ireland. We could do a deal with France, Norway, and 12 miles out, and we're in international waters anyway. Why aren't we breeding the types of fish to release into the wild? That's a no-brainer. We've got more waterways than any other country in the world. And yet, I was looking, doing a study on the corruption. We've got more corruption than India, not per capita, more corruption from 70 million people against 1.3 billion, 1.4 billion, whatever India is. We've got more corruption, and we've probably got more waterways. So all of that, all of those waterways that aren't being used could be used, and we could use horses pulling barges, and there's all your fertilizer. And all of the horses who are just laid up in the fields now, costing a fortune. All the stables are all going bankrupt or out of business. All the horses they're all charity events now, all the stables. They could be working as they worked before. This country has never been as rich as when horses were working the land and working the waterways. So it's clean energy. You couldn't get it. Can you get any cleaner? Plus, it takes people to manage that. And it also takes tons of freight off the roads, freeing up the roads for, better use. So the agriculture, fishing, and that's transport, isn't it? There's three dead easy solutions that can bring people back to the cultural norms, the cultural values that our country is built on, not the cultural values that they want to pick out the air and tell us that we need or that we're getting. Like, these are the ones that are deeply embedded into our psyche and into our biology right off the bat. It's a no-brainer. And obviously, common sense is seen as criminally insane in Parliament, which is a reflection of parliamentary think, isn't it? So there's three solutions. Now, you could say, oh, if we bring barges on horses, blah, blah. Yeah, well, we've got warehouses. The country is literally, especially in the north, literally full of massive empty warehouses that go back to the cotton mill days. You can easily build more warehouses. Warehouses are not a problem. So we can store and we can have surplus grain. We can have surplus stored foods. We can actually live in surplus rather than in deficit. So we just need more horses and more barges and more people working on the waterways. And then we can move more stuff. It may take slower, but at the end of the day, it gets the job done. And the farmers will be producing tax-free food for 10 years. That's got to be a step in the right direction. Do you know what I mean? And that can help us fund, defence and strategy, military kind of technology, IT and computers and cybersecurity, and even have our own sort of insular, like in Korea, they have their own versions of internet, south and north. China's got its own great firewall, all paid firewalls, this, that, and the other. So the country could literally have, its own .co.uk, which is tiered or whatever, and it's also like more contributory rather than regulated by, YouTube or whoever, EU. Many of the laws that govern what we're seeing on the internet is governed by Germany, because everything's in the international, like that. So if you make a comment, then if you go to Germany, you could be arrested for making a comment not in that country, just because the way German law works. So that's unfair. Now, where's our government fighting that corner for free speech? We have every right, whereas the American governments do fight that corner for every right to free speech. So the UK and US has always been seen, from a UK perspective anyway, has always been seen like, we're like the little brother to them, but we're the older brother. So we're like weaker, but more well established and trustworthy and honest and fair, and all of these things that the British are famous for, which have crumbled immensely from how the infrastructure is run, how the politics is run. Look at Epstein. Ghislaine Maxwell was driving around London, picking up all the schoolgirls for Epstein, and the house was in London, and that's where the Israeli Prime Minister was going. That was happening in London. But like, it's as if it all happened in America. It's not the case. It happens in London. Well, where's our aim? In fact, I'm made up to see Jess Phillips resign. That's perfect. So the thing is like, you've got all these brains, and basically none of them know how to knock their own heads together to come up with a single idea. And the idea is that they do come up with, if they did come up with anything pro-British, then the media would tear it apart. Parliament would probably tear it apart. So I think, like, you've got things like sanctions on different countries and that. I think the people really need to start thinking about sanctioning Parliament, boycotting Parliament, and undermining their claimed authority, because there's a little bit of overreach going on when it comes to, like, self-autonomy. It's like everyone's like looking to Parliament to tell you whether you can do this or that or the other. And it's like, hang on, we all live under under God's blue sky, on God's green earth. And I'm referring to Marshall McLuhan's ideas that as long as we have internet, telephones, which they never had internet while he was alive, but as long as we have telephone, we have devices, any electronic device, and even prior to that, any device that we have for communication, for means of communication, undermines any authority for any representation required. And obviously representation is required for administrative or managerial means, but it's not to be dictated on us how we're to think. It's to be dictated by the government how the nation, the national direction is to go, because of the will of the people. Not that the government carves its own idea of what the will of the government, what the will of the people suits their agenda. Because obviously they've corralled the public purse, which has been their target, and now they've got it. All eyes are on them, and it's like, well, what are you going to do? So there's no private sector, really. There's no entrepreneurs. There's no support for entrepreneurs. So the whole undermining of the private sector startup kind of idea, of which, Israel just happens to be the startup capital of the earth, and which, like in America, we've probably seen a lot more pushback into Israeli influence in American politics. We've not really seen that in British politics per se. Obviously, the politicians would be cried that claim and offered in that they've, always suffering and they're the victims, this, that, and the other. But there's no real pushback. There's no sort of like Dan Bilzerian standing in Rotherham or City of London, or there's no Casey Putch running, or any of these kinds of like people who are running in the US now. We haven't got. I guess we've got kinds of like Sivnat types, but they're yet to be tested. And from how we're seeing the way that Trump and his Sivnat direction has geared towards the will of his advisors being carried out, because it seemed that Trump was not going in the directions that he's now going, which is a shame. And there was a point actually where you could tell that his life and his family's life had been threatened, and it was like, well, I'm not leaving the planet yet, not if I can see it through. So, in many ways, it's like there are terribly um, inhumane things that are happening, but in the bigger scheme of things, that's kind of like dictated in history as that's it's kind of what's required at those levels. The stakes kind of demand these things until equilibrium is found. Look at Mao's China, look at Stalin's Russia, those kinds of like equilibriums are now finding something of a status quo that is more humane, more human, because you're still not allowed to talk about the Holodomor. You're still not allowed to talk about anything that undermines the CCP. Even in Britain, it's sort of like frowned upon. Like recently, there was some MPs or some advisors or someone who've been charged with spying for China. And my argument is like, what were they spying on? To drag us kicking and screaming into the 21st century, 22nd century, wherever China's gone. What secrets have we got that China already doesn't know? Turn it in. There's got to be more to that. So they're my kinds of things. Construction, they stopped making clay bricks in favour of concrete and resin. And yet clay is just dug out the ground and put in the kilns that we've had for thousands of years. We've got some of the best clay brick buildings in the world. And yet all of that has been sacrificed for glass and steel because it's cheaper. And yet, look at what it's brought. It's stagnated the chain. There's a chain, isn't there? There's sort of like the soil, and the people dig the clay from the soil, then they burn the forms of the clay, which are in bricks, and then they get delivered to, wherever the building's got to be built. And now you've got how many people getting employed, you're creating wealth, you're creating shelter and warmth and beauty. So it's like, whereas with glass and steel, you could still be creating wealth and beauty, but you're not creating the employment chain where people have purpose, because that's what it's all about at the end of the day, isn't it? You'd have a purpose to go to work, a purpose to build the houses, a purpose to deliver the brick, and a purpose to kind of like maintain the structures for as long as they can be maintained. Many of the Romans were, there's Roman ruins still existing in Britain today, and they're perfectly fine. Hadrian's Wall, Chester Wall, York, even the Tudor times, like 500, over 500 years old, whatever. These things are still absolutely fine. Whereas you look at like a cladding warehouse that's maybe 10 years old, and it's weathered, it's beaten, it's not beautiful, it's performative, it's not inspiring, it hasn't got a spiritual uplift. And I think there's much more value in that politically, economically, commercially than is being given credence to with these absolutely criminal, insane people in Parliament who are obviously all grifting and hawking. And it may not be all of them all of the way, but it's all of them at least part of the way, you know. So if you stack all them layers of, well, it's, 60% of Kemi Badenoch is well bought into the parliamentary rhetoric, and she may have her own 30% private thoughts and 10% kind of nondescript. So 60% of her input is directly buoying up the parliamentary thrust. Keir Starmer, you could say, okay, give him grace. He's like 70% bought in, 30% not bought in, or whatever. He's got his own private thoughts. So there's, of 200%, now you've got 130, 140% from 200%. So as you go through that whole 650 people, so maybe you get like 6,500% would be fully bought in, which some of them will be, they absolutely have to be, because to get away with that grift, I was watching one guy on Politics Joe, Chris Lewis, or whatever his name is, and he's a first generation immigrant, or his father came here from another country, from Caribbean, and he's an MP, and he was talking about how he's doing politics on the beach in Thailand. So if he can be on the beach on Thailand, why can't any of his constituents be notified as to what their thoughts are on the beach in Thailand? Why do they need him as a mouthpiece? Why can't he just be a normal constituent? And you probably don't know about Stafford Beer's VSM, which was basically a computer setup, and it was before Pinochet. They had a computer which ran the government, so anything that was lacking in the country's resources, the computer would log it and say, well, we need more of this, and the country as a whole nation would work towards, making sure there was surplus of that. And I think that's the word that needs to be ground in, is surplus over deficit, basically. Yeah, so tie that in with Marshall McLuhan's idea of, I guess it's not even Marshall McLuhan's idea, it's just normal general common sense. So anyone doesn't really need to be like dependent on government. Whenever government is overreaching and forcing the people to be dependent on them, that needs to be policed, and we don't have that policing. And obviously the lawmakers are going to make sure that we don't have that policing, because it's to their benefit. Cui bono? Well, it's massively to their benefit, but it doesn't mean to say that, like, I think in Ireland they had the concept of spoiling the vote, where they put the X in all of the boxes, or I think it's all of the boxes to spoil the vote. So it's like a none of the above type thing, whereby the vote can't be counted because it's not a vote for a single party. It's spoiled. But we know the game. The parliaments aren't going to allow... The parliamentarians won the Civil War, so they're not going to allow anyone over them. But it doesn't mean to say that they can't be undermined. And whether they should be, it's kind of like, well, look at this pantomime that's going on now over Starmer. Obviously, he's under the sword of Damocles with the last final thread of the rope, attached, and one ping, and the sword of Damocles goes right through the king's head, and that's it. It's curtains for his career. So apparently they were talking about I think this was on the Duran, and they were saying he probably hasn't been offered a job or a position that would suit him, that that suits him, that he's agreed to, which is why he's hanging on. Um, some people have said that if he does the full term, he gets more pension. So the stakes are high, not only on his personal level, but the pressure. You can imagine being a director of the CPS as he was. Um, the absolute corruption that goes on there on the daily. He was walking on air in that place. So there's absolutely water off a duck's back. In his mind, he's walking on air everywhere he goes because he doesn't care as long as he's picking up them paychecks with the guarantees of the pension. Then, like in his speech, he said, "I'm responsible." Well, how are you responsible? How are you holding yourself accountable? What are you doing to pay back to cover, this responsibility that you're claiming that you've got? And obviously that was only the responsibility to the party, this, that, the other. But the thing is Labour had pledged to build 2.5 million houses every year or whatever it was. And they've built 318,000, which is, I think it's less than 10%, or it's about whatever percent it is. Let's see. So 300,000, 3 million would be, 300,000 would be 10%. So yeah, it's about 15, 16, 17%, which is not, it's not exactly killing it, is it? And in some instances, they've blamed the Greens, saying that the Greens have claimed that, it, it's cronyism, the houses don't meet the green standards, blah, blah, blah. So just change it, just make the houses the way the local government wants it. That's all you have to do. But no, they can't do that because, the backhanders, the power plays behind the scenes, these construction companies who are all going bust, they dictate in many ways, and Parliament is a huge example of property, property companies, lobby groups running the Parliament, which can be seen from Keith Joseph, who was the son of Bovis, the owner of Bovis, which was the largest construction company in the 80s until Langs came along. But I don't think Bovis suffered loss and Langs took over because of a suffering of loss. I think it was because Langs came in from Ireland, so they, overtook. So it wasn't that Bovis dropped, it was like Langs overtook. And he was in the cabinet, and he said he was a failure. Well, depending on what your aims were, which we don't fully know, yes or no. But at the end of the day, what he did and what he caused to happen caused all of the housing stock to be sold off, the banks to cash in on the mortgages, which they're still cashing in, and now no one can get a mortgage. So it's triggered that chain reaction. And I think that's one of the things that Thatcher has not called out for, is the chain reactions that exist today that started from her changing the banking rules, in order to end kind of northern dominance in England, because England isn't really a fruitful country in so much as like, like China is the breadbasket of the world, Ukraine is like the breadbasket of Europe, Saudi is like, Saudi with all the oil and such. Africa is just a huge abundance of corruption. You literally dig corruption off the ground, and you're on a complete winner. So England is like that. England's a bit of a special case. It's very flatlanded. We've got rolling hills. It's a very grasslandy. Much of the land is kept by landowners going back to the Norman conquest. They might grow raspberries, blackberries, they own sheep or whatever, cattle. So having the financial centre in London was an absolute diamond for those types who kind of like weren't keeping up with the Arabs, because in the 70s, that was when the petrodollar, but Thatcher came along with in the 80s with the City of London financial centre kind of kicking off with the yuppies. And, that's been in answer to that. But for the sacrifice of it, there was the miners, the shipping, the steel, the fisheries, and gold mining was banned, so you couldn't mine gold anymore. So you basically had no means to make your own wealth in the north, which is what that was all. The north was heavy industry at the time. So the place has been flooded with heroin, and they've just like killed off a generation, and then they've changed the drug to cocaine, and that's just been devastating, obviously, with the crack cocaine and everything. So those things were started under her remit. So she's all right running around the USSR. You know, I don't think she would have had too much vodka there, would she? So while she's running around there waving to no one for the PR, then what is England getting in return for all of the Russian oligarchs coming here and outpricing everything in London? This whole balloon effect of like, it wasn't really needed to be caused, and yet it was caused. So you could say, well, Britain needed the billionaires to come in. Well, did it? I thought they changed the financial wizardry into being the finance hub of the world, at the sacrifice of the North, losing all of the heavy industry. So why didn't they just keep the heavy industry and have the financial centre? That seems to be a win-win, and I think that's what we're trying to clamber back. Clamber. The wealth creation was in the north of England. Scotland is a great wealthy nation, different to Britain, UK at least. Even Wales on its own could probably like punch above its weight. But England is it's a special case because of its topography, its geographical position. We could have built a bridge to Europe, like what they've built in Hong Kong to China, or Malmo to Copenhagen. These great big bridges. It's sort of like they gave us a tunnel. Tunnels now the use nor ornament. And yeah, it's just an isolated place. But I met someone from the Cayman Islands, and they said that the bankers in the Cayman Islands, called Britain or UK, they call it Treasure Island. because it makes so much money. So make of that what you will. You know, they basically went from the largest empire in the world ever known to bankrupt in 1951 because of Manny Shinwell, the Labour Party, what was he, Environment Secretary or something. And I think it was the coal strikes. They froze the people for 3 years. In 1951, I think the Americans lent us $50 billion or whatever. And that tied us to America in different ways, other than the military kind of saving that they done for us in, World War II, whatever. Then that was a military binding, and now this is an economic binding. And obviously, because I grew up in a modern town which had American companies coming out the gazoobular, so you had Kraft, Kodak, Birdseye. The list was just endless. Delco, Macro. It was just like the whole town was just set up around serving American consortium because it was a modern town. Cantors. There was just an endless amount of American concerns. So there's your commercial bindings. So there's not really much left. Certainly after the abdication of Edward VIII, was it? They've cut off the god's head, which is the king. He's so that is the second king who's kind of gone through war. Charles I, Edward VIII. Don't know probably King Harold in 1066. So there's a pattern. 3 makes a pattern. And America is not the Valhalla of everything that can be. I mean, go and watch Christina F. Go and watch that movie. I always thought West Berlin was supposed to be a showpiece for the Western world. Well, it turns out it is, but it's not what I thought it was. And I only seen it maybe 5 years ago, and it certainly puts into perspective the Epstein class, the capitalist West, the reliance of the capitalist West on the communist East, which, funny enough, when I was reading about someone had suggested that the fall of the Berlin Wall was the start of the problems today. Well, that would be the end of the Thatcher years. And, that's the accumulation of, that's why she went to USSR, basically. Now you've got China, and if you'd ever watch Putin and Lavrov, they're always harking back to this kind of Soviet era thing. Now, I've heard that because the Soviet was starting to become successful, productive, and established, that was why the plug was pulled on the Soviet system. Now, this could well happen again with China. I don't think China is fully in control of their own destiny in ways that, many people might suggest, optimistically might suggest that China is, hoping that we can, be a feeder fish off the big shark like that. And I think that if China is to have its rug pulled, which would basically be keep the West absolutely poverty stricken, you know, corral all of the money into the small group who's got all the money now. Because like there's no way I can be here and compete with Amazon when it comes to money distribution, wealth distribution. The whole of the British population can't compete with Amazon. Upon the issuance of, the annual budget for UK in, 2026, 2027, Amazon will just hoover up everything they can, and Microsoft will be in there, and they're all just hoovering up all of the free money. It's free for them anyway because they don't pay any tax. Whereas we're left with just like seeking out the crumbs and having to pay the taxes on those crumbs and kind of like struggling to build families, have homes, just have normal cultured living, which is owed to us because that's what we represent. That's the vein of what we've come through. And basically, the governments are allowing all this to happen. OpenAI has got a UK government contract. Microsoft has got a UK government contract. And these are all big contracts. And yet we've got some of the most technically advanced people trained here, bar none. Tim Berners-Lee invented the internet. He's English. You've got, I think was it Analytica, that company from Cambridge or some big data company, they've won a contract now and they've moved to China, and Starmer claimed that as a victory for Britain because they were brought up, the company was kind of nurtured in Britain and is seen as a success beholden to him because they've scarpered to China and got a big multi-billion-dollar contract. So we're being brain drained by, used to be called third world countries, now it's called developing countries. But how can China be called a developing country who still gets aid from us? Like it literally, you can go on gov.uk and find the information about the aid that China still gets. And we've given them back Hong Kong. So you're telling me that China hasn't benefited from all of the, staunch capitalists who made up the majority of Hong Kong, understand capitalism to a great degree that is functional, pragmatic, practical, and, worthy of 1.4 billion absorbing those ideas into their demographic so that they can prosper from the ideas of what they call communism, which is basically socialism. Now with all of these capitalists who used to belong to Britain in Britain's heyday, so you can imagine the kinds of the networks that they have, the deep understanding of how money moves, how money fluctuates, the values and weights, and all of the inside, the inner knowledge of like bananas become ripe at such a place, so that's a big time to invest in bananas, or how will bananas harvest this year as some beetle got loose, or all these kinds of tangible goods, stocks and commodities that capitalism is built on. That's the whole idea, isn't it? Shares and investments and insurances, reinsurances. So they're just some thoughts to ponder that I wanted to share. So hopefully more than one people will see this, more than one person. Take care. Bye.